Hey, it's Chris Moberg coming to you with another installment on quantum training videos. Well, to be fair, this is really a redo on the run types. I felt, given recent clarifications on the Dynocom forum, that I should rework this a little bit to incorporate the discussion there. So that's what I'm going to do. All right, so when looking at the run types, we access those with new run, and once again, certain run types will be available to you only if you have an eddy brake, and other run types may not be available to you given the kind of version of quantum that you have. So with that said, let's jump in. So the gear roll is sort of the bread and butter of dyno testing. It is going to be the one that you use for baseline pulls, for dyno day pulls, for watt pulls in tuning. It's a quick and dirty way to get basic horsepower and torque numbers. You can do it with or without load, and it's pretty simple to operate. Get up to your target speed where you want to start the run, hit go to the terminal speed or RPM you want to go, hit go again. Quantum then produces the graph. So let's see what we have available to us on the next screen to set up this test, and we see it's the basic load screen. I've talked about this screen in another video, so I won't go over it in any detail here, other than to say that all these types of load are only available to you if you have an eddy brake. So let me cancel that, go back in here, new run, and next go to the negative test or coast down test. A coast down test is used to compute drivetrain loss. And drivetrain loss is important in the calculation or derivation of engine horsepower and torque from wheel horsepower and torque. And this in turn is important to our world customers who deal in engine terms, where U.S. domestic users tend to deal in wheel horsepower and torque terms. So the way you do a negative test is you go up to a terminal RPM/speed, throw the car in neutral, hit go, let the car decelerate without touching brake or clutch. When you get to 30 miles an hour, hit go again. At that point, quantum figures out what the drivetrain loss is and will compute a metric that from that point forward in the session can be used to convert your wheel numbers into engine numbers. And you have the option, what to show on your graphs, either wheel or engine. And let's see what we have available to us on the negative test. That would be nothing. There is no setup required on the negative test. You just need to do it as I've described. So next we have the engine power test. Well, engine power is really a compound test. It combines gear roll on the way up and negative on the way down. It's sort of this simplified or operational improvement for you if you are interested in engine numbers. You can do one of these engine tests and then do gear rolls afterwards. Essentially, you start it like a gear roll, hit go, accelerate up to your target RPM/speed, hit go, throw in neutral, come down to 30 miles an hour, hit go again. It really is like the two tests just combined in one. If we look at what's available to us in the next screen, we see it's all of the standard load options. And this is really because this is a gear roll-on combined with a negative. So we get sort of the intersection of those two tests, which is this. So that is that. Moving on, we next come to the speedo test. Speedometer test, in the context of tuning, is useful to calibrate the speedo in the ECU. Let's say the car or truck is sporting bigger tires with a different rolling diameter. This would throw off the speedo, and so the speedometer test can tell you by how much it's throwing it off. And on some ECUs you set a ratio, and this would help you set the ratio. The other use for it is you could make your services available to local police for calibrating their cruisers. And similarly, you might choose to market to local lawyers to help their clients with speeding tickets calibrate their cars. You're probably best dealing with one of those two groups rather than both of them. Anyway, let's look at what's on the next screen. And we see that you're going to do a speedo test from for a distance and from a speed to a speed by a step. And it's kind of like the speedo step test. And step duration is the hold time on each step. So the nice thing about this is a customized report, speedo report, that could make a nice deliverable to your police or lawyer clients. So let me look at what we have after that. You run race. Okay, so a race test is one that is structured to simulate, you doing a race. So, you can roll through the gears, you can go a particular distance. You might do a race test if your plan is to later visualize, as I'm highlighting here, up on the session viewer, race visualization. So you could do, a race test where you row through the gears, which would be typically different than what you would do on a power test, where you're staying in one gear. So next, look at what we have there. So we can see, various types of tests. You can either do them from a dig or a roll, put the weight in, enable VRS or not. I want you to hold on that thought. We'll talk about VRS a little later, but you can do this test with VRS engaged or not. And that's what I'll say about that one. File, new run. Well, as promised, now we'll talk about virtual road simulation. One of the things you realize on the dyno is it's really different than running on the street or the strip, both from a cooling perspective, airflow perspective, but really the big things are aerodynamics, wind resistance, and acceleration. Typically, the car does not weigh the same as the mass of the roll. So, in short, what virtual road simulation does is it employs the eddy brake to add variable force to the roll during the course of the pull to simulate the forces that would be acting on the car on the street or the strip. So let's see how it can be set up to do that. All right, so this test actually has 3 different options on how you can run the test. And on each of these options, we have the ability to include the inertia, that is the mass part of the calculation, or not. The reason for doing this is VRS is going to heat the eddy brake, and it's going to heat the engine of the car, and so you can get some of the benefit, the aerodynamic drag, which will slow the run in a real world sort of way, minus the mass component. I would say you want to have the mass in there, because if you're really trying to match what it does at the strip or the street, you need the mass part. But if you're using it for tuning, like VRS, and when you're actually tuning, you may not want it. I would say that the general use for VRS is on a conformance run, although it's been suggested that it's the most effective way to do loaded runs. I guess the issue you have when thinking of it, loaded runs, you have some parametric control over this, but you're not dictating exactly where the load comes on or not. And depending on which way you're most comfortable doing your loaded tuning, you may want this automagic way, or you may want a more manual way. Okay, so that's sort of the backdrop, but what we have here is 3 different ways of doing it, and the power at 50, as this test that I'm hovering over is known. It's an EPA test. It is the one that Mustang uses, and so if you want to be like Mustang, you can do this power at 50 variant of the virtual road simulation. It's like, all you have to do is put in the magic power at 50 number. Now, make a sidebar here that if you picked from the menus when you were doing your session creation for year, make, model, you're going to access the EPA database that's shipping with Quantum. It's the one that Dynocom had to create. I don't mean that EPA just has one of these, but that database has the power at 50 for each of the cars that's in it. So if you have something after 1996, there's some good likelihood that it would be found in the database. Now, caveat is, for any of these EPA tests, they're based on like stock body work. So if there's something different, like it's got a wide body kit on it, or it's got some other modifications, these 2 bottom tests, the vehicle coefficient and power at 50, they'll be in the ballpark, but they're going to be off because you've changed the aerodynamic part of the vehicle. So that would take me to the parametric version, and this is the one that has the potential to be most accurate if you have accurate information here. So, frontal area you can sort of calculate. Drag coefficient is tougher. You generally have to look that up and then fudge it based on what changes might be happening to the car. Did it get more slippery, less slippery? Rolling drag is a function of the tire, and not a huge component, but sticky tires have more friction, and so they might be as high as 0.015. You also have an ability to simulate going up a hill, as you might do on the street when you're doing a pull. So that's the best. And I know I glossed over this ABC model. This is another EPA one, and basically comes to the coefficients come out of this database I spoke of, It'd be probably a little tricky to try to find these, if you're setting up this test, if they're not there. So pick your subvariant of test, and you should expect that the parametric one could be within a third of a second of actual time on the street. If it's not, you have a VRS correction factor. You can come down here and you can bump the time up by making a number greater than 1, and you can bump it down by making a number less than 1. So it's a scaling, a lot like the load cell correction factor, same sort of deal. You're scaling it. So that is what I will say on VRS. So next we have the whole family of PAU tests. So let's look at PAU constant first. And here I'm going to have another sidebar and say the PAU tests as a whole are closed loop tests where the load screen that's present on like the gear roll is open loop. So in open loop, Quantum commands the eddy brake to deliver some percentage of force through that percentage of duty cycle. But it doesn't look to see if that is being achieved. It just says do it. The PAU tests set a percentage duty and then monitor it and adjust the duty to achieve some target that it's trying to hold. So it's a feedback loop, and so it's a closed loop. The PAU constant test holds something constant. So it can hold speed or RPM, marginally useful, I guess. The big one is it can hold force. Okay, so in holding force, let me contrast that with static load. Static load says deliver some percentage of force. But there's no feedback. There's no confirmation that that force is being delivered. And I've shown in other videos that when you use static, there's actually tailing off of the load. It is not purely constant. So what we've got with this closed loop constant force test is you can put a target force in, 250 pounds, 500 pounds. And this is just another way of saying how much force. Rather than a percentage, which depending on your load cell would be hard for it to hold constant. It doesn't know, because it's going to read pounds. It's not going to read a percent. So you have to put pound, some pound value in to have it deliver that. And also, this is the tractive force. Okay, so in summary, you've got this ability to dial in a closed loop force through the PAU constant test, or you have an ability to do open loop force through the load screen on the gear roll test. And so this is a important distinction. And if you are having trouble with maintaining a constant load, when your eddy brake gets hot or when RPM changes, this is the test to use to overcome those limitations. Alright, so let's move on then. Next we have the step test. A step test is useful to measure power and fueling at various step points. And so it's a lot like steady state mode 1, but if you picture say a fuel map with load along Y and RPM on X, steady state mode 1 typically you go to an RPM and then with the accelerator you hit different load points at that RPM. What the step test is going to do is you're going to hold TPS constant. So TPS is kind of a proxy for load, and then Quantum is automatically going to step from one RPM to the next, to the next, to the next. And as it steps, it will hold on each RPM for prescribed time. This allows any axle enrichment or other fuel instabilities to work themselves out, so you get true fueling, and then it goes to another RPM. So where mode 1 you were sort of running up the columns of this visualized map, with the step test you're kind of cutting across the rows. And so, you know, the step test would be useful if you have you're doing flashing tuning, so it's not real time, and you could do the step test, then examine the log data in either your ECU logger or the Quantum log, make fueling changes, do another TPS setting, do the same, and so it's a pretty good way to do you know, flash tuning, fuel and or spark tuning. Not particularly well suited to real time. You know, if you're using an aftermarket ECU that has real time updates while tuning, then I would strongly suggest using mode 1 on the handheld, and you know, as you're tuning, you're seeing the changes in real time reflected, you know, on the horsepower and torque and air fuel on the handheld screen or in your ECU log or screen. And yeah, it's very much more effective to use mode 1 for real-time tuning. All right, so let's look at the details. You know, you can do your step test on speed, RPM, or force. I'd say typically it's speed or RPM. You've got your start value, your end value. You know, these are in units of whatever test channel you're doing. Step rate also in units of whatever you're doing. Test duration, this is the hold time on each step, and this is the total test time. So basically what you're managing with all these parameters is a balance between getting stabilized readings at each step against heating the eddy brake in the car up. So it's this step size and test duration that you really have to sort of juggle to you know, have the granularity you need, but also working with the test duration. If you find that the car will settle in 5 seconds on each step, set this at 5. Don't hold it for 10. So minimize test duration to minimize heat buildup in car and eddy brake. So that's about it for step test. File, new run. And we have the ramp test. Ramp test is, quite simply, holding acceleration at a constant rate. So you might want to do this to control for different acceleration rates, causing different power productions. There's been some discussion on the forum about acceleration rate and sort of the parasitic heat loss. So by controlling acceleration rate, you may have ability to minimize the parasitic loss. It also gives you a consistent way to make sure that the engine is measured and pulls the same way each time. It also is delivering variable load to meet the way boost is building and whatnot. So we control this by once again, we can go speed or engine RPM. We have units of that test channel to start and end. We have a test duration. I'm not sure what the duration is on the ramp, other than I guess here we're controlling the accel rate and the max test. So I'm not sure what test duration's doing here. So anyway, I don't use this very often, but it can achieve the goals of uniform acceleration. All right, so let me go to the last one then. PAU program force test. This is the most flexible and customizable test. It sort of replaces the parametric test that was in Dynocom X. It is a topic all unto itself. Let me suffice it to say that if you have a challenging vehicle in terms of its peaky torque or very nonlinear axle or torque, this may be the answer to how you do targeted load to extract max power. And that concludes the overview of the various run types available in Quantum.